They thought it was just an old well, something forgotten, something harmless. But when they drained it, they didn't find water at the bottom. They found a hidden room filled with chains, bones, and a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. And the deeper they went, the more they realized something down there was still alive. Stay with me, because what they discovered next will make you question everything. In the quiet town of Briar Glen, silence had a way of settling in too deeply. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence people longed for when they escaped the noise of the city. This silence felt older, heavier. It clung to the trees, to the empty roads, to the weathered houses that seemed to lean slightly inward, as if they were listening. At the very edge of town stood the Whitmore house. Most people avoided that part of Briar Glen altogether. Not because it was far, but because something about it made them uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. The road leading to it was cracked and narrow, with branches from old trees hanging low like reaching fingers. Even in the middle of the day, sunlight struggled to touch the ground there. The house itself was large but tired. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind faded wood that had turned gray with time. The windows were clouded with dust, some cracked, others completely boarded up. The front porch sagged slightly, as though it had been holding its breath for decades, but it wasn't the house that people feared the most. It was the well. Behind the house, beyond what used to be a carefully tended garden, stood a circle of old stones. Moss had grown thick between them, and weeds twisted through every crack, reclaiming what had once been human-made. At the center of those stones was the well, dark, open, and endlessly still, no cover, no rope, no bucket. Just a hollow drop into darkness. It didn't look particularly dangerous at first glance. In fact, to someone unfamiliar with the town's quiet warnings, it might even seem ordinary. Just another forgotten structure left behind by time. But no one in Briar Glen treated it that way. Children were told never to go near it. Parents didn't explain why. They didn't need to. The way they said it, sharp, serious, final, was enough to stop any questions before they could fully form. If you go near that well, they would say, don't come back crying. It was a strange warning, not angry. Not threatening, just certain. Over the years, stories had formed, passed quietly between neighbors and friends. Some said the well had run dry long ago. Others claimed it had never truly held water at all. A few older residents insisted that something had happened there, something no one wanted to write down or remember clearly. But no one ever told the full story. They would begin, then stop. They would shake their heads and change the subject. And always, without fail, their eyes would drift, just for a second, toward the direction of the Whitmore house. For nearly 40 years, the property sat empty. The last known owner, a man named Edward Whitmore, had died under unclear circumstances. There were no close relatives to claim the house, and over time, it simply became another forgotten place. A place people learned to walk around, until one day someone didn't. Daniel and Sarah Hayes arrived in Briar Glen on a warm afternoon in early summer. Their car was packed with boxes, their voices filled with excitement that felt out of place in such a quiet town. They had been searching for a home for months, somewhere peaceful, somewhere affordable, somewhere they could start fresh. When they found the Whitmore house listed online, it seemed almost too good to be true. A large property at a price far below its value. To them, it was an opportunity. To everyone else, it was a mistake. The real estate agent had been unusually quiet during the showing. She avoided certain areas of the house, rushed through explanations, and didn't linger long enough to answer too many questions. But Daniel didn't notice. He saw potential, space, possibility. Sarah noticed a few things: the way the air felt colder inside, the faint smell of damp wood, the uneasy stillness, but she convinced herself it was nothing more than an old house being an old house. They signed the papers within a week. On the day they moved in, a few neighbors watched from a distance. No one came over to welcome them, no one offered help, and no one mentioned the well. It wasn't until later that evening that Daniel first saw it. He had stepped into the backyard, stretching his arms after hours of carrying boxes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. That was when his eyes landed on the circle of stones. He walked closer, curiosity guiding his steps. "Hey, Sarah," he called out, "there's a well back here." She joined him a moment later, brushing dust from her hands. "Oh well, yeah, pretty old though." They stood at the edge looking down. The darkness inside wasn't like normal shadow. It felt deeper, thicker, like it swallowed the light instead of simply hiding from it. Daniel picked up a small rock and dropped it in. They waited 1 second, 2, 3, then a faint splash. "That's deeper than I thought," he said. Sarah didn't respond right away. She was staring into the well, her expression tightening in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. "Do you smell that?" she asked softly. He paused. There it was, a faint odor drifting up from below. "Sour, damp, unpleasant. It's probably just old water," Daniel said. "We can get it cleaned out." Sarah nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the darkness. For a brief moment she thought she heard something. Not a voice, not exactly, just a shift, a movement far below, too soft to be certain. She stepped back. "Let's go inside," she said. That night the house felt different. The excitement of moving in slowly gave way to something quieter, something harder to name. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than it should have been. Every shadow stretched a little too far. Daniel fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day. Sarah didn't. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first there was nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, she heard it, a sound, faint, distant knock. She held her breath. Another knock followed, slow, deliberate knock-knock. Her heart began to race. She sat up, straining to listen more carefully. The sound didn't come from the walls. It didn't come from the floor. It came from outside, from the backyard, from the well. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached over and gently shook Daniel awake. "Daniel," she whispered, "listen." He stirred, half asleep. "What is it? Do you hear that?" He stayed still for a moment, then shook his head. "Hear what?" But the knocking had already stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before. He sighed and turned over. "It's just the house. Go to sleep." But Sarah couldn't, because she knew what she had heard. And deep down, in a place she didn't want to admit existed, she knew something else too. The sound hadn't been random. It hadn't been natural. It had felt intentional, as if something, far below the surface of the earth, was trying to be heard. And for the first time since arriving in Briar Glen, Sarah began to understand why no one in town ever spoke about the well. Some silences weren't empty. Some silences were hiding something. Expand Chapter 2 into 1,000 words long. The days that followed were not loud or dramatic. They didn't need to be. What settled over the Whitmore house was something quieter, something that crept into the edges of every moment until it became impossible to ignore. The smell was the first thing that changed. At the beginning, it had been faint, easy to dismiss, the kind of thing you wrinkle your nose at and forget a second later. But now it lingered. It clung to the air in the backyard and followed them inside, slipping through open windows and curling into corners like it belonged there. It was no longer just sour. It was heavy, damp, and beneath it all something metallic. Sarah noticed it most in the mornings. When the world should have felt fresh and new, the air instead felt stale, like it had been trapped underground for years and suddenly released. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on unpacking, arranging furniture, making the house feel like a home. But the house didn't seem to want that. Drawers stuck for no reason. Doors creaked open when she was certain she had closed them. And every so often, she would catch herself pausing completely still because she thought she heard something. Not inside, outside, from the backyard, from the well. The knocking didn't happen every night. That made it worse. If it had been constant, maybe she could have explained it away. Pipes, animals, wind hitting something loose. But the silence between the sounds gave them weight, meaning. The second time she heard it, she didn't wake Daniel. She just listened. Knock, a pause, knock, knock, slow, measured, almost careful. Her chest tightened as she pulled the blanket closer around herself. It felt deliberate, like someone waiting. The next morning, she stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard. The well sat in the distance, quiet and unmoving, as if it had never made a sound in its life. Daniel walked in, stretching as he grabbed a cup of coffee. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" he asked, noticing the tired look in her eyes. She hesitated. "I heard it again." He sighed softly, not out of annoyance, but out of uncertainty. "Sarah, I know what I heard." He leaned against the counter, thinking, it's an old place. There's probably something loose out there. Maybe the wind. There was no wind, she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. The room fell quiet. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the window. "All right," he said finally, "then we'll check it out today." But when they stepped into the backyard, everything felt normal. Too normal. The air was still. The garden, though overgrown, moved only slightly under the weight of its own neglect. The well stood exactly as it had the day they arrived, silent. Daniel approached it cautiously, as if expecting something to change the closer he got. He leaned over the edge, peering down into the darkness. "Hello," he called out, half joking. His voice disappeared into the void without an echo. Nothing answered. He picked up another small rock and dropped it inside. They waited 1 second, 2, 3. Then the faint, distant splash. "See," he said, stepping back, "just water." But his voice didn't carry the same confidence as before. Because now, standing this close, he could smell it too, stronger than ever. It hit him all at once, thick and rotting, with that strange metallic edge that made his stomach tighten. "Okay," he admitted quietly, "that's not great." Sarah crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "It's getting worse." He nodded. Yeah, for a moment neither of them spoke. The well seemed to sit between them, not just physically but emotionally. It had become something more than a structure. It was a question neither of them wanted to ask out loud. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "We should clean it out." Sarah looked at him. "What?" "It's probably just stagnant water. Maybe something fell in there years ago, an animal or something that would explain the smell." "And the knocking?" she asked. He hesitated. "If there's debris shifting around or water levels changing, it could cause sounds." Even as he said it, the explanation felt thin. But it was something, and right now, something was better than nothing. Sarah looked back at the well. Every instinct in her told her to leave it alone, to walk away, to pretend it didn't exist, just like everyone else in town seemed to do. But the smell wasn't something they could ignore. And the sounds, they were already too deep inside her thoughts. "Fine," she said quietly, "then we deal with it." Daniel nodded, relieved to have a plan. That afternoon, he made a few calls. It took longer than expected to find someone willing to take the job. Most contractors he spoke to either refused outright or came up with excuses. Too busy, too far, not equipped for that kind of work. It didn't make sense, until one of them paused after hearing the address. "The Whitmore place?" the man asked. "Yeah." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'd rather not," the man said finally, his voice lower now. "Why not?" Another pause. Then the line went dead. Daniel stared at his phone, confused. By evening, he finally found a small crew from a nearby town willing to come the next day. They didn't ask many questions, which felt like a blessing, or maybe a warning. That night, the knocking returned. Louder than before. It started just after midnight. Knock. Sarah's eyes snapped open. Knock, knock. She sat up immediately, her heart pounding. "Daniel?" she whispered urgently. He groaned, still half asleep. "What is it?" "Listen." This time he heard it. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from outside. From the direction of the well. They both sat there in silence, counting each second as the sound echoed through the night. Knock. A pause. Knock, knock. Daniel swung his legs off the bed, his face tense now. "Stay here," he said. "No," Sarah replied quickly. "I'm coming with you." They moved through the house slowly, the wooden floors creaking beneath their feet. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner darker than it should have been. When they stepped outside, the air felt colder. Still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. The well stood in the distance, barely visible under the faint glow of moonlight. The knocking had stopped, of course it had. Daniel took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. "Hello," he called out again, his voice tighter this time. No answer, no movement, just silence, but it didn't feel empty. It felt aware. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Let's go back inside." He didn't argue. The next morning, the workers arrived early. 3 men in a worn truck, their expressions neutral but alert. They carried their equipment toward the backyard without saying much. But the moment they saw the well, something shifted. One of them slowed down, another exchanged a glance with his partner. "You didn't mention how deep it was," one of them said. "We don't know how deep it is," Daniel replied. The man frowned slightly, then shrugged. "All right, let's get started." They set up the pump near the edge, running thick hoses down into the darkness. The machine roared to life, breaking the silence in a way that felt almost violent. Dark water began to rise. Slowly at first, then steadily. It spilled out into the surrounding ground, soaking into the dry earth. The smell hit them immediately, stronger than ever before. One of the workers covered his nose. "That's not normal." Daniel didn't respond. He just watched. Hours passed. The water level dropped inch by inch, revealing more of the stone walls inside the well. The sunlight barely reached the bottom, leaving most of it hidden in shadow. Then, suddenly, "Stop the pump," one of the workers shouted. The machine shut off with a heavy silence. "What is it?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. The worker pointed down, his face pale. "There's something down there." Daniel leaned over the edge, his heart beginning to race. At first, he couldn't see it. Just darkness. Then, as his eyes adjusted, the shape began to form. Not natural, not random, a straight line. A corner, and then an opening, a doorway carved into the side of the well itself. Daniel stepped back slowly, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. "That's not possible," he whispered, but it was. And deep down, beneath the fear and confusion, a single thought began to take shape. Whatever was making those sounds, it wasn't just coming from the well. It was coming from something inside it. For a long moment, no one moved. The air around the well felt tight, like the world itself was holding its breath. The workers stood frozen, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, fear they didn't want to name. Daniel stared down into the opening again, hoping his eyes had tricked him, but the shape remained. A doorway, clean, deliberate, impossible. "This isn't right," one of the workers muttered, taking a step back. "Wells don't have doors." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Her fingers curled into her sleeves as she whispered, "We shouldn't have touched it." Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down he felt it too, the sense that something had been disturbed, something that had been left alone for a reason. "We need to call the police," another worker said firmly. This time, no one argued. Within the hour, the quiet property was no longer quiet. Police vehicles lined the narrow road, their presence drawing distant eyes from neighbors who had stayed silent for years. Officers moved with careful urgency, setting up lights around the well, their voices low but controlled. It didn't feel like curiosity, it felt like caution. One officer, younger than the others, secured a rope around his waist. He glanced down into the darkness, then back at his team. "I'll go," he said. As he descended slowly into the well, the rope creaked softly. Every movement seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel and Sarah stood side by side, watching, barely breathing. "I'm at the bottom." The officer's voice crackled through the radio. A pause. "There's a structure here, stonework." Another pause. "I'm going inside." The silence that followed stretched painfully long. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her ears. Her mind raced with questions she didn't want answered. Then finally, Jesus. The officer's voice came back, but it was different now. Shaken, unsteady. "You need to see this." When they pulled him back up, his face had lost all color. "What's down there?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer swallowed hard, his eyes unfocused for a moment, as if trying to leave what he had seen behind. "There's a room," he said slowly, "a full room carved into the ground." Sarah's breath caught. "And?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. The officer hesitated. "Chains," he said. The word landed heavily, and bones. The discovery beneath the well changed everything. What had once been a quiet, forgotten property at the edge of Briar Glen was now surrounded by flashing lights, police tape, and a growing sense of dread that spread through the town like a slow-moving storm. People who had spent years pretending the Whitmore house didn't exist now found themselves unable to look away. Because deep down, many of them had always known. They just never expected the truth to come back to the surface. The investigation began that same night. Large floodlights were set up around the well, turning darkness into a harsh, artificial day. Officers moved with careful precision, their footsteps measured, their voices low. No one treated it like a simple discovery. There was a weight to their actions, a quiet understanding that whatever lay below was not just old. It was wrong. Forensic teams arrived shortly after. Dressed in protective gear, they descended into the well one by one, vanishing into the same darkness that had hidden the truth for decades. Above ground, Daniel and Sarah stood at a distance, wrapped in silence. Neither of them spoke much anymore. There was nothing left to say. Every answer they had wanted was now waiting below. Hours passed. Each time someone emerged from the well, their expression told a story they hadn't yet put into words. Pale faces, tight jaws, eyes that avoided contact. It wasn't just what they were seeing. It was what they were beginning to understand. By morning, the first details started to surface. The chamber beneath the well wasn't small. It wasn't accidental. It was built, carved carefully into the earth and reinforced with stone. The room stretched wider than anyone expected. The walls were rough but deliberate, lined with iron hooks that had long since rusted but still held their shape. Chains hung from them, some broken, others still locked in place. There were marks on the floor, deep scratches. Repeated, as if something, or someone had tried desperately to escape. Sarah covered her mouth when she heard that. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, but it didn't comfort her. Nothing could, because this was no longer a mystery. This was suffering preserved in silence. In one corner of the chamber, investigators found what looked like a crude sleeping area, if it could even be called that. Torn cloth, old straw, the remains of something that suggested people had been kept there for extended periods. Not days, not weeks, long enough to lose hope, long enough to be forgotten, and then came the bones. Carefully, slowly, forensic experts began to uncover them. At first, just fragments, then full remains. More than one, more than a few. Each discovery deepened the horror, turning unease into something heavier, something harder to carry. The town watched from a distance as the evidence was brought up piece by piece, sealed in bags, documented, recorded. The past was no longer buried. It was being pulled into the light whether anyone was ready or not. But the most disturbing discovery came later that afternoon. It was a small wooden box, hidden behind a loose section of stone. At first glance, it didn't seem important. Just another forgotten object left behind. But when they opened it, everything changed. Inside were personal belongings, simple things, a rusted watch, a ring, a small locket. Items that once belonged to people who had lived normal lives. People who had families, names, stories that ended without explanation. Until now, Sarah couldn't stop staring at the items when she was told about them. Each one felt like a silent voice reaching out from the past, asking to be remembered. But there was something else in the box, something far more unsettling. A journal. Its cover was worn, edges frayed with age. The pages inside were fragile, yellowed, but still intact. Every line was written in careful, deliberate handwriting. The name on the first page read, Edward Whitmore, the same man who had owned the house, the same man who had vanished from history without answers. Until now, the journal was handed over to investigators who began reading through it immediately. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Entries about daily life, weather conditions, notes about the land. It painted the picture of an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But as the pages turned, the tone began to shift, subtly at first, a single line here, a strange phrase there. References to sounds, to silence, to things that didn't quite make sense. Then it changed completely. The handwriting became uneven, more frantic. The words no longer flowed, they stumbled, as if written by someone whose thoughts were breaking apart. He wrote about voices, not outside, below. He described hearing them through the ground, faint at first, then clearer over time. He wrote about how they disturbed his sleep, how they followed him even during the day. They do not stop. One entry read, "They call without words." Investigators exchanged uneasy glances as they continued reading. This was no longer just a record. It was a descent. Whitmore wrote about building the chamber, not as a place to hide something, but as a way to contain it. He believed the voices came from beneath the earth itself, that something was down there, something restless, something that needed to be silenced. And so he began bringing people. At first it wasn't clear how or why, but the pattern was there. He wrote about offering them to the quiet, about how the voices would fade temporarily after each time, as if whatever he feared demanded something in return. Sarah felt sick when she heard that. Daniel turned away, unable to process it. This wasn't just cruelty. This was something deeper, something broken, but the journal didn't end there. The final pages were the hardest to read. The writing had become chaotic, almost unreadable in places. Words overlapped, sentences repeated, thoughts spiraled into themselves. And then on the last few pages, there was only one line, written again and again and again. "They are still down there." No explanation. No clarity, just a statement, a warning, or maybe a confession. The room fell silent when the last page was read. Even the investigators, trained to face the worst of humanity, didn't speak for a long time, because this wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was something that blurred the line between reality and something far more unsettling. The official explanation came quickly. Edward Whitmore had been mentally unstable. The chamber was his creation. The victims were taken over time, hidden away where no one would find them. A horrific, isolated case. Closed, contained, but not everyone believed that, because some details didn't fit. The structure of the chamber, the depth of the well, the way the tunnel seemed older than the house itself. And the words in the journal, "They are still down there." It didn't sound like the end of something. It sounded like it had never truly stopped. As night fell over Briar Glen once again, the well stood under guard, surrounded by light and watchful eyes. But even then, even with everything exposed, something about it still felt untouched, unfinished, like a door that had been opened but not fully understood. And deep beneath the earth, beyond what had already been discovered, the darkness remained, waiting. Expand Chapter 5 into 1,000 words long for a brief moment. The town of Briar Glen believed the worst was over. The well had been drained, the hidden chamber had been exposed, the truth, dark and unbearable, had finally come into the light. Police reports were written. Evidence was catalogued. The story spread far beyond the borders of the small town, turning the Whitmore house into something it had never been before. A place people talked about openly, even if their voices trembled when they did. On the surface, it seemed like closure, but beneath it, something still felt unfinished. Daniel and Sarah didn't stay long enough to see what came next. They left within days. They packed their belongings in silence, avoiding the backyard, avoiding the windows that faced the well. Neither of them slept properly anymore. Every small sound made their hearts race. Every shadow felt like it was watching. On their last night in the house, Sarah stood in the hallway, her hand resting against the wall, as if she were trying to feel something beneath it. "I can still hear it," she whispered. Daniel looked at her, his face pale. "There's nothing there anymore." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Because sometimes, late at night when everything was quiet, he heard it too. Faint, distant knock. He never admitted that to her. The next morning, they left Briar Glen without saying goodbye to anyone. And neither of them ever came back. The investigation, however, did not end with their departure. If anything, it deepened. The discovery of the chamber raised too many questions that couldn't be answered by the journal alone. There were inconsistencies, structural details that didn't match the timeline of the house. signs that parts of the underground space were far older than Edward Whitmore himself. And so, the decision was made, a final sweep, one last search beneath the well, not just of the chamber but beyond it. The team returned with more equipment this time, stronger lights, ground sensors, reinforced ropes. There was a quiet determination in their movements, but also something else, hesitation. As if every step forward came with an unspoken understanding that they might not like what they found. Descending into the well no longer felt like entering a crime scene. It felt like crossing a boundary. The chamber, now fully drained and illuminated, looked even more disturbing than before. Without the shadows to soften its edges, every detail stood out with brutal clarity. The hooks, the chains, the marks on the walls, and the silence. It wasn't empty. It pressed in from all sides. The lead investigator, a man named Carter, stood in the center of the room, slowly turning as he examined the stone walls. "Check everything," he said, "no assumptions." The team spread out carefully, running their hands along the rough surfaces, scanning for anything that might have been missed. That was when one of them noticed it. "Here," a voice called from the far side of the chamber. Carter walked over. At first it didn't look like much, just a section of stone slightly out of place, but the edges were too clean, too deliberate. "Help me move this," the investigator said. Together they pushed. The stone shifted with a low, grinding sound, revealing a narrow opening behind it. A passage, dark, tight, leading further into the earth. For a moment no one spoke, because this wasn't in the plans. This wasn't in the journal. This was something else. Carter exhaled slowly. "We go in." The passage was narrow enough that they had to move single file. Their lights cut thin beams through the darkness, revealing rough walls that felt older than anything they had seen so far. The air was colder down there, thicker, harder to breathe. Each step echoed softly, swallowed almost immediately by the silence. After a few minutes, the tunnel widened slightly, then it split. 2 directions, then 3. The team paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "This wasn't just a room," one of them whispered. Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's a network." They marked their path and continued forward, choosing one of the tunnels at random. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. The walls began to change. The rough stone gave way to smoother surfaces, almost as if they had been worn down over time, not by tools, but by touch. Repeated endless, then came the markings. At first they were faint. Thin lines scratched into the walls, easy to miss unless you were looking closely. But as they moved further in, the scratches became clearer, deeper, more desperate, long jagged marks running along the stone, overlapping each other, covering entire sections of the tunnel. Carter stopped, raising his light. "These aren't old," he said quietly. One of the others stepped closer, running a gloved finger along one of the grooves. Dust fell away, revealing a sharper edge beneath. "Fresh." The word hung in the air without being spoken. A cold realization settled over the group. Whatever had made these marks, it hadn't been here decades ago. It had been here recently. A sound broke the silence, soft, faint, so faint it could have been imagined. But they all heard it. Carter turned sharply. "Did you?" A knock. The team froze. The sound came again. Distant, echoing through the tunnels. Knocky knock. No one moved. No one breathed, because they all understood in that moment something they couldn't explain. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't the tunnel settling. It wasn't water shifting. It was deliberate. Measured, the same pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. One of the investigators whispered. "That's the same sound they reported." Carter didn't respond. He couldn't, because now, hearing it himself, there was no explanation that felt real enough to hold on to. The sound came again, closer this time. Knock, a pause, knock, knock, back. Carter said suddenly, "We're going back, now." No one argued. They turned and moved quickly, their controlled steps turning into something faster, less steady. The tunnels seemed longer on the way out, the darkness heavier, as if it didn't want to let them go. Behind them the knocking continued, not chasing, not rushing, just following. By the time they reached the chamber, their composure had cracked. They climbed out of the well faster than protocol allowed, pulling each other up without looking back. Once they were above ground, the world felt different, too bright, too open, but not safe, not completely. Carter gave the order immediately, seal it. There were protests at first, questions about procedure, about evidence, about what might still be down there. But Carter didn't hesitate. Seal it, he repeated, and so they did. The entrance to the hidden passage was closed off permanently. The well itself was reinforced, covered, and locked under strict supervision. Officially, the case was closed. The report stated that all accessible areas had been investigated, that no further threats were detected, that the sounds reported were likely structural or environmental, a conclusion, an ending, but not everyone believed it. Because some of the investigators refused to speak about what they heard, others requested transfers shortly after. And Carter, he retired early, no explanation given. Today, the Whitmore property still stands. Abandoned once again, the well is no longer visible, hidden beneath layers of reinforced steel and stone. But the land hasn't changed, not really, because sometimes late at night, when the wind dies down and the world falls quiet, people who pass by that road claim they hear something. Faint, distant, almost impossible to notice unless you're listening for it. 3 slow knocks, a pause. Then 3 more. And if you stand there long enough, if you let the silence settle deep enough, you might begin to feel it too. That quiet, creeping certainty that whatever was found beneath that well was never fully uncovered. And whatever made those sounds is still down there, waiting. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon, hit that notification bell, and join us for the next story, because there are more rooms below the surface of American history than any official record will ever admit. And we intend to find them. We'll see you in the next video.